Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's installment of the fall seminar series hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. For those of you joining us for the first time, each year we invite leading international scholars working on different aspects of Hellenic studies to present their research on a wide range of topics in the fields of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, modern Greek history, as well as literary cultural studies. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that today's seminar was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam's peoples. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, please visit the SFU IT services website. I now turn to our speaker. I am delighted to present Dr. Nikolaos Papadogiannis, who is an AHRC Fellow in History at the University of St. Andrews. His first monograph, entitled Militant Around the Clock, Left-Wing Youth Politics, Leisure and Sexuality in Post-Dictatorship Greece from 1974 to 1981, was published by Berhan Books in 2015. He has published numerous articles, several articles on the history of sexuality in international journals, such as the Journal of Modern Greek Studies and the European Review of History. His current project explores the link between spatial mobilities and sexual transformations in West Germany and Greece in the 1960s and the 1970s. He is also a principal investigator of a project on transnational AIDS activism in Western Europe in the 1980s, from the 1980s to the 1990s. A warm welcome to Dr. Papadogiannis, who I also had the privilege of collaborating with in the past on different projects. Dr. Papadogiannis, we look forward to your talk.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, good evening. We are across the globe, I guess. Can you hear me and see me well? Thanks.
Absolutely, perfectly well.
So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the Center in general and Irini Kotsovili in particular for inviting me and hosting me. It's really an honor for me. And let me try to share my screen. So I hope that it still works fine. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to discuss sexuality, tourism, and social and political transformation in Greece between the 60s and the early 80s. So in the early 80s, feminists in Greece maintained that rapists don't have a nationality, adding that rapists can threaten both Greek and non-Greek female tourists. My paper considers both this dark side of tourism alongside its empowering effects on the sexual lives of the Greeks between the 1960s and the early 80s. In particular, this presentation explores how Greeks from diverse social and political backgrounds approached sexual changes in Greece in relation to their intensifying engagement with tourism in this period. The mid-80s witnessed the growing debate around HIV/AIDS, whose impact on the sexual and travel patterns of Greeks merits further study, so I will stop there. My talk considers both heterosexual and queer individuals, male and female, and it analyzes working, lower middle, and middle-class individuals. To avoid exceeding the time limit, I have sadly focused on cisgender people only living in the urban centers, but my research in general also explores transgender people, as well as individuals, transgender and cisgender, who resided in rural Greece in this period. So I'm happy to elaborate more on those individuals in the Q&A session. So my main argument is that tourism catalyzed sexual transformations in Greece, which followed what I would like to label as a curved or meandering path. Let me explain, as this might sound too opaque. The era between the 60s and early 80s witnessed simultaneously both the subversion and the reproduction of norms regulating sexual affairs. Therefore, in line with what recent historiography of sexuality argues about Europe in general, Greece witnessed no linear path towards more sexual freedom. So this is not a story of an ever-increasing sexual liberalization or a sexual revolution full stop. I would like to present, hopefully, something more complicated. In analyzing this curved path, the presentation aims to take an intersectional approach, which considers the interweaving of gender, race, within quotation marks, and social class in relation to the social experience of diverse Greeks on vacation, but not just the experience, but also the representations of such experience in mainstream and alternative outlets. In particular, my paper argues that tourism was a context that helped amplify the growing freedom of heterosexual and cisgender women in Greece to express in public their sexual desires, especially from the 1970s on. Meanwhile, the 1970s also experienced the demarcation of gay spaces in Athens. For example, a growing number of gay bars appeared in Athens in this period. What I would like to argue is that also from the early 70s on, a growing number of Greek, but also obviously of non-Greek gay men began to travel to Mykonos, and Mykonos holidays were an opportunity for gay men from diverse countries, not just to escape from limitations that they faced in their everyday lives, but also in the case of Greek gay men, to reflect and help reshape gay venues in Athens, such as the gay bars that I have just mentioned. But, as I said before, when talking about the curved path, the 1970s did not merely mark a trajectory of ever-growing sexual freedom for diverse individuals in Greece. Instead, norms regulating sexuality were also reinforced, both ones that had existed in the preceding decades, as well as new ones. An entanglement of gender and race-related perceptions underpinned the new norms regulating sexuality from the 1960s. Such norms were what sociologist Michalis Nikolakakis depicts as, I quote, pedagogies of leisure, namely prescriptions of how women should appear on the beach and what being sexy should mean for them in the context of the growing engagement of Greek men and women with tourism. These pedagogies contained not only a gender, but a race-related element, so-called foreign, European, or Northern women, namely female tourists from Central and Northern Europe, as well as from North America, were portrayed as role models on the one hand, but also in a quite ambivalent manner as examples to avoid for Greek women. So on the one hand, the mainstream press primarily depicted those women in an essentializing manner as stylish, but also stereotyped them, reproduce bias against them, construing them as so-called sex-thirsty to a lesser or greater extent. The latter representation informed discussions of rape of women, Greek and non-Greek, and the case of rapes shows how sexual norms emerging in the 1960s dovetailed with older ones, namely the machismo on which the attitude of the rapists was based, and overall restricted women's freedom of sexual expression, both on vacation and in their everyday lives. While these changes in sexual norms were linked to tourism, I would like to avoid the deterministic approach in which tourism appears as the only factor causing them. Hence, the paper argues that tourism didn't cause, but actually catalyzed those changes. The relationship between sex on vacation and in everyday life is a paradoxical one, I would argue. Tourists often frame holidays as a unique opportunity for sexual experimentation due to escaping from their routines, the transnational contact with people with different sexual norms, and what they experienced as the so-called stimulating effect of sun and sea. But such experimentation actually accentuated changes in sexual norms that those people experienced in their everyday lives. So rather than being disconnected, sex on vacation and in everyday life mutually reinforced shifting sexual perceptions. In this vein, tourism was a testing ground for social and political transformations whose cumulative impact on sexual norms was, as I mentioned, ambiguous or followed this curved path trajectory. What were these transformations or these developments, if you prefer? Shifting consumer cultures and the creation of new leisure from the 60s and all throughout the 70s. Later on, what happens is what Vasilis Karapostolis labels as a diminishing tolerance of Greeks towards material deprivation. There is what I believe it's an interesting edited volume that Irini Kotsovili has co-edited with Kostis Kornetis and myself, where we argue this in comparison what happened in terms of consumer cultures and gender in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. So that's one transformation. The second is a growing influx of non-Greek tourists, already in the 50s, but the number of non-Greek tourists skyrockets in the 60s and the 70s. In terms of politics, quite important change, as I argue, is not so much 1974, not so much the collapse of the dictatorial regime that had ruled Greece between 67 and 74, but actually the emergence of a second wave feminist and the gay liberation movement in the mid to late 70s. And finally, as we will see, another important factor is the growing circulation of popular magazines from the 60s on, which among others conveyed these pedagogies of leisure that I mentioned beforehand, but sometimes also voices running counter to those pedagogies. So, overall, the paper, what it tries to do is to take a transnational and social history approach. In line with the former, it tries to complement the recent tendency in the historiography of sexuality in Europe in the 1960s and 70s to address transnational encounters. What had happened so far until very recently was a focus on so-called distinct national cultures. More recent historiography tries to address transnational flows of ideas and people, not just through tourism, but also migration, for example, and their impact on the sexual cultures of different European countries. In taking a social history approach as well, my talk tries to connect with the emerging research on race-related perceptions in Greece. And while such scholarship has focused on the era between the late 19th and mid 20th centuries, I believe that racializing ascriptions figured quite prominently in public discussions in the period I would like to analyze between the 60s and the early 80s. In referring to race, within quotation marks always, I employ its definition by historians Rita Chin and Heide Fehrenbach. And according to them, racial ascription is hierarchical and implies a hard and deep sense of difference, which can be framed as biological and/or cultural. The latter reigns supreme in the racialized ascriptions that I examine in my talk today. My paper considers some of the most popular magazines in Greece, like Tachydromos and Pantheon, and scrutinizes two influential newspapers, the broadly center-left Ta Nea and the conservative, right-wing, if you prefer, Vradyni. It also builds on data from social surveys, opinion polls, and 30 oral testimonies that I have conducted. There are a number of methodological pitfalls. I can briefly mention some and obviously happy to discuss them further in the Q&A session. So in the case of interviews, is it possible that some interviewees romanticize their experience or even tried to boast about it? Do the oral testimonies reflect mainly the expectations of the interviewees and not really their actual practice? I would focus on the former, so I would not take what is mentioned in the interviews for granted. I would just view it as part of the self-identity of the interviewees. My analysis will proceed in 3 steps. I will first address tourism as a catalyst of the growing freedom of young heterosexual women to display their sexual desires. I will then show how the practice and public discussion on rapes limited such freedom. And finally, I will discuss gay tourism to Mykonos in relation to norms regulating the behavior of gay men as a point of reflection for emerging gay venues in Athens. So, during the 1950s and 60s, a conjugal model regulated gender and sexual relations in Greece. Female sexuality had to be heteronormative and was regarded as legitimate only after marriage. However, the prescriptive level did not necessarily reflect the actual sexual relationships of young women and men, which were sometimes far more complicated. It was not atypical for some women to be willing to engage in sexual relationships before marriage. However, premarital sex, that was the norm, had to be kept covert. Such a norm was prevalent both in rural Greece and in the working class and lower middle class districts of the urban centers. We could actually say in most of Greece. However, sexual relations experienced some contradictory transformations in the late 60s and early 70s in Greece. The dictatorship that ruled the country between 1967 and 1974 promoted a normative discourse which praised sexual restraint and marriage. Still, by 1972-73, according to Kostis Kornetis, women had become about 1/3 of all students. They mingled with young men within the premises of the university and in youth leisure spaces, such as in discotheques, which had been emerging from the preceding decade. As Kornetis argues, and as some of the interviews I have conducted show, this interaction apparently encouraged open flirting, which often, though not always obviously, entailed premarital sexual relationships in heterosexual couples. Those youth spaces served as so-called transformational contexts, in the words of Loizos and Papadogiannis. Let me quote, "There, women defended versions of their personhood that are total, i.e. that include their sexuality as an independent variable, instead of concealing it or merging it with procreation." End of quote. So young unmarried women felt less constrained to keep their sexual activity covert. Meanwhile, the echo of the transnational hippie counterculture also reached Greece. Its major connotation, not only for a minority of radical university students, but also for broader segments of the Greek society, was the so-called sexual liberation in a positive or negative manner, but this is how it was discussed. Overall, these changes contributed to young women and men socializing more frequently in peer groups comprising young people, so not necessarily with their family members. And within those peer groups, young women felt freer to flirt and sometimes even have sex before marriage. As a result of this confluence of factors, young people began to socialize in these peer groups, which is something that quite a few social surveys demonstrate already from the 1960s on. So while this shift was not unique to Greece, it resembled changes happening elsewhere in the West. It was not a mere carbon copy of developments in other Western European and Northern American societies. In contrast, for instance, with West Germany and the UK, in the case of Greece, the contraceptive pill never became very popular. Moreover, let me note that the relaxation of family control in the socialization of young people, young women and men, did not lead to a decline in stable relationships and marriage. While young women and men felt freer than in the preceding years to engage in ephemeral relationships, non-marital relationships, a survey published in Επιθεώρηση Κοινωνικών Ερευνών, a very important journal about social studies in Greece, showed that the main aim of both young men and women in the 70s and early 80s was to find a so-called serious, long-lasting relationship ultimately. Similarly, similar were the results of opinion polls conducted by ICAP in the mid-70s. Moreover, the average age of first marriage fell from around 30 years in 1960 to 28 years in 1980 for men, and from around 25 years in 1960 to 23 years in 1980 for women. This condition was similar in this case to transformations in other Western countries like West Germany, for example, where more freedom for young heterosexual women to have sex before marriage and be open about it did not ultimately make them unwilling to marry. Meanwhile, tourism gained momentum among Greeks and people living in the West in general. So again, it was a broad change. Young people were trendsetters, being more willing to travel than individuals belonging to older age groups. Unfortunately, figures in the case of Greece concerning the exact number of young Greeks going on vacation are not available for the 60s and 70s, but there are for the early 80s, and they show that quite a substantial segment of young Greeks aged up to 24 years old traveled quite frequently. Moreover, let me note that in the population in general, there was an increase in domestic tourism traveling within Greece from the 1960s on, and this was accommodated by improving living standards and also by relevant legislation. For instance, the 1945 law foresaw that employees who were aged 18 and older and who had worked for at least 12 months for the same employer were entitled to 12 days of paid vacation. So overall, tourism did not automatically contribute to the formation of peer groups of young people where young women felt free to flirt and have sex before marriage. It was obviously a far more complex process. In the early to mid-60s, for instance, autobiographies of young left-wing women at that point, the left gained momentum within Greek youth. So these autobiographies showed that quite a lot of them were reluctant to go on vacation with men, which might have earned them a bad moral reputation. The left at that point upheld strict moral codes, which prioritized stable heterosexual relationships leading to marriage, and which the left counterposed to what it described as a so-called over-sexualized American way of life that mushroomed, according to the left, in capitalist societies. In practice, it could be assumed, however, that at least since the 60s, there was a limited, perhaps, number of peer groups comprising usually middle-class left-wing students, female and male, who went on vacation together, but usually on the condition that a male relative would act as a chaperone for the women participating. I should also note that strict regulation of sexual relations was not unique, was not confined to the left. It appeared in the texts of diametrically opposed political subjects to the left, such as the Greek Orthodox Church. In any case, the winds of change began to blow already at that point. Case in point is the letters that teenage women, influenced by emerging youth cultures and rock music, sent to popular magazines such as Pantheon. In these letters, they expressed the desire to flirt with young male fans of rock music while they were all on holiday. However, it is unclear from existing sources whether they did flirt and whether they also traveled without their family. So moving to the early 70s, what happens is that at that point, flirt within peer groups while on vacation became the hobby horse of what I would like to label as the alternative pioneer women in Greece. These were students, female students, inspired by left-wing ideas, fighting against the dictatorship, and were also influenced by the aura of the transnational hippie counterculture. Going on holidays could serve as an opportunity generator, enabling those young women to make new friends and find new partners. A vacation could also consolidate existing friendly and sexual bonds developed in university halls and leisure venues in the urban centers, Athens and Salonika. In these cases, holiday making amplified rather than being the breeding ground for non-marital sexual relations. But one way or another, tourism featured prominently as a rite of passage to personal autonomy from parents. So going on vacation and flirting there, it was construed by those women as a process through which they became autonomous, if not completely independent, not controlled by their family. This is a point that vindicates what Richard Jobs has argued, namely that tourism served as a rite of passage to freedom from parents for young people across Europe in the post-1945 years. In the case of the Greek alternative pioneers, it would entail destinations traveled to Western Europe, such as Amsterdam, Spain, even the United States. A female and private high school pupil recounted to me that, I quote, "I traveled to New York in 1971. I thought it was very revolutionary to cross the village and visit the Bronx and Harlem by myself. We had to differ from our parents. We have to differ from the bourgeois class," end of quote. She also narrates, referring to her experience as a high school pupil until 1972 and subsequently as a university student in France. I quote, "We stayed in some miserable hotels in camping sites. We had to travel to the least popular tourist attractions, the less expensive destination. It was part of the framework of our emancipation," end of quote. So what interviews with members of these peer groups illuminate are the lack of luxury coupled with flirting while traveling as subversive, or what the interviewees label as hippie acts. So these excursions were a crucial moment of transgression that those former pupils shared and which were frozen in their memories. It's quite interesting that this experience and the shared memory of it within the peer groups appear to have consolidated an enduring friendship. To borrow the phrase of the oral historian and social anthropologist Ricky van Busschoten, it is part of the collective memory that remains unchanged. However, travel was not confined to alternative pupils and students in the early 70s. An increasing number of young Greek people set off for the Greek beaches during the summer vacation, especially from the mid-70s on. There are not exact figures, as I mentioned beforehand, but there are several autobiographies, letters sent to magazines, and what interviews reveal in terms of expectation is that even when young people didn't manage to travel, they were expecting at some point to be able to travel with their friends and there have the chance, among others, to flirt. So tourism appears to have become popular among young left-wingers of all stripes in the 1970s. The post-1974 era, namely after the collapse of the dictatorial regime, also witnessed a resurgence of the Greek left within the youth. Of course, we have to be careful. The opportunities for vacation varied according to several parameters, such as age and gender. Women, especially high school students and those who came from working class districts and rural areas, often faced restrictions from their families. As one of them who came from a working class family in Piraeus narrated to me, I quote, "I had to wait until I was older to get into university in order to go on vacation with my peer group," end of quote. So most young left-wingers who went on vacation opted for usually 1 or 2 weeks of vacation, and they would travel in July, or August. They would particularly love to travel to islands like Folegandros, Schinoussa, Anafi, Ios, Sifnos, and Santorini, which you can hopefully see on the map. What they would do is, while being there, they would construe the excursions to those islands as pathways to what they viewed as far as possible, unmediated contact with nature. And such endeavors included free camping or even spending the night under the open skies in sleeping bags by the sea. You can see an example on the photo. I have removed part of this so that the faces of those young people are not recognized, but they are sleeping in a tent by the sea while traveling in summer in the mid-70s to the Cycladic Islands. Let me mention also a quote from an interview. A young socialist in the 1970s narrated to me, "I have even slept in caves in Mykonos Island." Concerning transportation, young left-wingers, communists, and socialists preferred traveling on the deck of ships, and overall, as you can infer, they preferred cheap options regardless of their social class origins. In both their ego documents, in their autobiographies, and in the publications of some left-wing groups, this contact with nature and the freedom that free camping and spending the night under the open skies provided were framed as an invitation to flirt and sometimes have casual sex. What was particularly stressed in those autobiographies was the contact with the alternative travelers from Central and Northern Europe who traveled to Greece massively throughout the 70s, especially towards the late 70s. So young Greek left-wingers did not approach those non-Greek alternative tourists in a racializing manner. They did not treat them as quintessentially different from them, from the young Greeks, due to their different national origin, but rather because of their particular alternative lifestyle that was not actually dominant neither in Greece, but nor in Central and Northern Europe. So similar to the early 70s, transnational, unconventional, countercultural influences inspired young Greeks in terms of their sexual norms and patterns. Now, what sexual experimentation and vacation could mean? It could mean intense contact with their existing partner, young women traveling with their male partner when they were heterosexual, but it also tourism amplified the opportunities that young left-wing women and men had in their everyday lives to have sex before marriage, and crucially, for women to express in public their sexual desires. In the case of high school pupils, once again, sex on vacation was a rite of passage. It made them feel autonomous from their parents. It's interesting that despite the restrictive rhetoric of some left-wing organizations, quite famously or notoriously, the pro-Soviet communist youth group KNE, which favored stable heterosexual relationships before marriage in the mid to late 70s, even some of its members engaged in ephemeral sexual relationships and sexual experimentation while on vacation, something that actually the organization, despite its rhetoric, tolerated in practice. Holidays were a context not only for young left-wingers, however, but also for young members of the center-right, so if you prefer young liberals or conservative, members of ONED, to flirt and have sex in the 70s and early 80s. Especially in the early 80s are interesting because it's at that point that the center-right or right-wing, if you prefer youth, gains momentum. It becomes a massive organization, while a slow process of the decline of left-wing youth organizations begins. The exact expectations that young liberals pinned on their holidays varied depending on their social and cultural backgrounds. For instance, Archelaos Eliou, who came from a working-class family of Piraeus and was a university student in the 1970s, recounted that tourism enabled him to spend the whole day with his partner. Dimitris Georgiou, who came from a middle-class family of Athens and was a young professional in the 1970s, claimed that vacations marked the opportunity to have ephemeral relationships. In contrast with Eliou, the first narrator, Georgiou narrated that he was inspired by transnational countercultural trends, which, at least in terms of sexual norms, he tried to imitate. What I'm trying to find in more detail are interviews from young women who were members of the center-right youth, So I don't have much to tell about them today, but hopefully in the next iteration of my paper, there will be more about from the perspective of women. And again, let me mention, since I guess a lot of you are based in Canada, liberals, in the case of Greece, in this period we are talking about the center-right or right-wing youth. This is how it portrayed itself. Now, traveling to Greek islands was not the hobby horse just of politicized people, left or right wing. Also, young people who were not affiliated with any political group engaged in travel. For instance, a memoir of a group of friends who studied at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in the early to mid 70s and were affiliated to none of the organizations that were active at that point. It says that they enjoyed traveling in couples and that holidays strengthened their bonds with their partners. So in this case, tourism helped consolidate their existing sexual relationships. But not all Greeks felt free to flirt and have sex on vacation, pretty much as not everyone felt free to travel. So the intersecting impact, once again, of gender, social class, and geographical origin needs to be considered. For instance, the oral testimony of Kiki Aslanidou, a university student in the early to mid 70s, leaning but not affiliated to the left and who came from a lower middle class family from a provincial town in northern Greece, shows, in my opinion, some important ambiguities. At least since the 50s, university student associations had been arranging excursions for final year students, mainly to Western Europe. Aslanidou and her partner, Papadopoulos, went to different university schools, but Aslanidou was allowed to take part in the excursion of Papadopoulos' school. However, she refused, as they were unmarried, and she feared that the fellow students of Papadopoulos would label her as immoral. By contrast, she felt more comfortable to travel informally to the Cycladic Islands only with Papadopoulos, even before getting married. The fact that the local people of those islands sometimes were reluctant to allow them to sleep in the same room, again because they were unmarried, did not deter her. So flirting and sex on vacation were neither a given, but nor out of the question for Aslanidou. What her narration points to are norms on female sexuality that may have been more restrictive in provincial Greece and may have affected some young women, even when they relocated from provincial Greece to the urban centers. Overall, although tourism was linked to sexual transformations in varying ways, what became a pattern among a broadening range of young people was the expectation or even the experience to have non-marital sexual relations on holidays. So this was a process of mainstreaming, starting from the alternative pioneers and becoming more popular, at least as an expectation. A wide range of mainstream newspapers and magazines, from Conservative Vradyni to Vima and Tachydromos on center left, published already in the 1960s and throughout the 1967-74, the era of the dictatorship, articles translated from other languages such as English, German, or French. And the ways these articles addressed sex on vacation diverged. They quite often contained cautionary tales about young women having ephemeral sex and feeling disappointed once their sexual affairs on vacation came to an end. However, there were exceptions. An article that initially saw print in Switzerland construed summer as the ideal context for sexual experimentation and challenging of relevant norms for young European women and men. What's interesting is that during the 70s, flirt and sex on vacation were growingly discussed in the same mainstream newspapers and magazines as phenomena happening in Greece as well. So these outlets did not continue to rely so much on translated texts. In the 70s, however, what happened was not just a mainstreaming of tolerance for more freedom for young women and also men to talk openly about sex before marriage, while on holidays and in their everyday lives. What also appeared was the effort to circumscribe this freedom in what was akin to what I mentioned at the beginning of my talk as a curved path, not a linear trajectory towards ever-growing freedom, but a more complex situation. Part and parcel of such circumscription was what the mainstream press promoted already during the 1960s, and Nikolakakis labels, as mentioned beforehand, pedagogies of leisure, or in other words, a systemic introduction of new practices to enhance the pleasures of activities done in one's free time. Those pedagogies targeted the body, mainly the female body, as a space of desirable transformations and gender performativity. A paradox emerged. The popular press got saturated with images and texts prescribing how women's bodies should appear on the seaside. These included suggestions, for instance, on what types of swimsuits women were expected to wear to be fashionable and how unattractive for men feminine body was. The mainstream press also set specific limits, as you can expect. For instance, women performing topless bathing were lambasted. So this was a condition that Nikolakakis labels as an excluding for women hedonism. The pedagogies of leisure rested not only on gender, but also racializing ascriptions. Female tourists from Central and Northern Europe, as well as North America, appeared as trendsetters both positively and negatively. On the one hand, they were role models for what mainstream press labeled as having a so-called attractive body, as mentioned beforehand, role models for Greek women. But on the other, the very same media outlets often construed non-Greek tourists, female tourists, as mentioned beforehand, quintessentially sex-thirsty, and thus a potentially, according to those media outlets, corrosive influence for Greek women. The representation of the purportedly over-sexualized foreign women began to be criticized in the early to mid-70s, especially when the second wave of feminism emerged in Greece. But the proliferation of those racializing ascriptions did not cease. Even well into the 80s, actually, such race-related perceptions continue to be communicated, and as I will mention shortly, underpinned some of the rhetoric around rapes in mainstream media. So let me then move to this issue of rapes, the darker side, the really darker side of tourism in Greece. These racializing ascriptions, as I have just mentioned, could actually help curtail the sexual freedom of women, Greek and non-Greek, and even cause their death, as manifest in the case of several rapes. The latter was has been a phenomenon with a very long history in Greece, not sufficiently studied so much. There is a very important new project led by Dimitra Vassiliadou that explores brutal intimacies, as Vassiliadou calls them, a history of rapes between the early 20th century and the 1960s. And more recently, Greece has witnessed a wave of femicides, often disguised in the mainstream media as so-called crimes of passion. However, rapes happened quite frequently between the 1960s and early 80s as well. Their exact figure is not known, as their victims often did not report them to the police. As a very important study of Kostavara Papariga has demonstrated, state authorities such as the police and the coroners were often unsympathetic towards raped women, an issue on which I could elaborate again further during the discussion. Still, existing data shows that in 1979, around 24% of women whose cases of raped women, whose cases reached the courtrooms, were tourists, It's not clarified, however, whether these were Greek or non-Greek tourists. Mostly non-Greek, I would assume, but still some Greek women, female tourists were raped. In the interviews that I have done, what appears is that travel to Greece meant for some Greek and non-Greek women an encounter with an aggressive behavior from local men. For instance, Katie, all the names I'm using are pseudonyms, by the way, mentioned that she traveled to Crete in the late 60s alongside two female friends from the UK. They all faced, as she narrates, an aggressive flirt from some local men and feared that the latter could force them to have sex. So to avoid this, they quickly moved away from those men. So going on vacation was marked by contingency regarding their sexual lives. In some cases, mentioned beforehand, earlier in the presentation, it could empower them to express their sexual desires. But here in the case of Katie, what Katie's example shows, what could also happen was that those women could be confronted with the profoundly entrenched machismo in the places that they visited. And such machismo not only limited their sexual freedom, but could also harm them bodily and traumatize them emotionally, with implications well beyond their holidays. It's noteworthy that the interview with Katie, during the interview, when Katie was narrating those moments, she was shaking. It was a very difficult emotional experience to narrate. So the link between tourism and rapes also figured prominently in media across the political spectrum throughout the post-dictatorship years. This happens especially from the mid to late 70s as a reaction to the growing feminist discourse on the phenomenon, which I will address shortly. However, the dominant approach of the institutions and media amounted to what I believe was a missed opportunity to debunk sexist and racist stereotypes underpinning rapes. So the dominant approach was tantamount actually to the racialization of non-Greek female tourists. From the center-left Tachydromos to the Conservative Vradyni and Apogevmatini, a wide array of outlets contained articles that claimed that foreign female tourists from Central and Northern Europe and North America were too promiscuous or so-called sex-thirsty. So in the most extreme cases, these articles claimed that those women provoked their rapes. So based on such bias and those racializing and sexist ascriptions, these articles went so far to question whether some of those women were actually raped. The article authors accused them of those women of being unreliable and having consented to have sex due to their so-called promiscuity and their desire for the purportedly fiery Mediterranean men. Similarly, Costavara Papariga, who has analyzed data from 4 rapes in the early 80s, including 2 where non-Greek women were raped, shows that some police officers, judicial authorities, and the lawyers defending the men accused of rape employed this stereotype of the sex-thirsty foreign woman to brush off the accusations. However, in the late 70s and early 80s, an alternative approach to rapes and racialization occurred. At that point, second-wave feminism emerged in Greece. It emphasized the freedom of women to control their bodies and sexuality. A crucial issue for feminists in Greece and other Western countries were rapes. So in the case of Greece, feminists questioned also the racialization of rape victims. They lambasted the view that the so-called foreign tourists are quintessentially promiscuous and they always desire, as the mainstream media said, sex with Greek men. So what feminists did was to launch several campaigns, such as on the death of a French tourist whom her rapist killed in Aegina, an island close to Piraeus, in 1982. You can see a relevant poster on the slide. So the thrust of the argument posed by Greek feminists was that on vacation, both non-Greek and Greek women were in peril of being raped, so feminist activists campaigned for women, regardless of national origin, to feel safe, even when they traveled solo or part of couples, one way or another, feminists stressed that it doesn't matter what their national origin is. What needs to be done is a challenge to the deeply entrenched machismo in the country. Something that, as I mentioned beforehand, did not really happen either at the level of mainstream press or the level of institutions. Let me now turn to the final part of my talk, sexual norms of gay men in Greece, which also followed the curved path between the late 60s and early 80s. In general, some background information. Male homosexuality in Greece had been partially decriminalized already in 1951. However, persecution of gay men continued based on Article 347 of Penal Code. And this article stipulated, for instance, that same-sex relationships between men were illegal if one of them was younger than 17 years old or if he gave money to his partner. What happens is that in the 70s, after the collapse of the dictatorship, there is no immediate change. Actually, the center-right government tries to pass a bill that would facilitate the closer monitoring of gay men under the pretext of the potential spread of sexually transmitted diseases. There was an outcry. This was the case. This was the period when the gay liberation movement gained some momentum in Greece, and as a result of the reactions against this bill within and outside of Greece, this bill was eventually withdrawn. In the meantime, at the level of everyday life, as very, very briefly mentioned at the beginning of the talk, gay bars began to appear, especially in Athens. What also happens in this period is growing gay tourism, a transnational phenomenon. For instance, the International Guide for Gay Men, Spartacus, was first printed in the very late 60s, and Mykonos featured prominently in this guide. Actually, in the mid-70s, Mykonos was represented as the so-called United Nations of gay men, where gay men from diverse countries met one another. It's interesting that transnational travel of gay men to Mykonos started under the dictatorship in Greece. The latter largely avoided the persecution of gay men in Mykonos in particular, quite differently from what was happening in Athens, as it wanted to avoid deterring the influx of tourists to Greece in general. So for Greek gay men, some of whom began to travel to Mykonos from the early 70s, this was an intense experience. For instance, one of them, who was a young gay man and university student in the early 70s, pseudonym Galidis recounted his freedom as a gay man to observe and have sex in public. So I quote an extract from his interview: "Gay men came to Super Paradise and lay on rocks and had sex." So this was something quite different from his experience at that point in Athens. In their public performances of sex, Greek gay men in Mykonos experimented with the types of sexual relationships that they forged. So at that point, according to Kostas Giannakopoulos, what became a norm among them, at least in Athens, were stable couples. Nevertheless, Greek gay men both experimented in Mykonos with ephemeral relationships and forged or stayed with partners in long-lasting relationships. So Galidis again recounted to me, "I went to Mykonos with an English boyfriend that I had at that point." But he also added later on in his interview that in his travel in general to Mykonos, "I went dancing proudly alone. Being alone does not last for long when someone else sees that you are available. After all, it does not take me long to flirt." End of quote. In this case as well, as happened with heterosexual individuals, race-related perceptions to address transnational encounters among gay men were not uncommon. Relevant oral testimonies from gay visitors from Athens to Mykonos do not constitute a representative sample, and there is no survey on the race-related ideas, perceptions that Greek gay men embraced in the 70s. However, the main magazine that addressed homosexual and gay individuals, including gay men in Greece at that point, Amphi, contained several references to the emancipated or so-called emancipated nature of the Northerners concerning homosexuality. This label, Northerners, referred to individuals from Britain, West Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavian countries. Such a reference to the purported cultural superiority of the Northerners is also evident in many of the interviews that I have collected. Greek gay men, young and older, quite often took pride in narrating their sexual encounters with West German or English men on Mykonos. However, oral testimonies indicate, according to oral historian Alessandro Portelli, a horizon of shared possibilities, real or imagined. So one of those possibilities is a trope employed by some Greek middle-class gay interviewees of mine who were in their 20s in the 70s, and they relativized this notion of the Northern superiority. They mixed class and social and race-related stereotypes. For instance, one of them said that he avoided West German working-class gay men who visited Mykonos. He described those men in a pejorative manner as so-called hairdressers. So Greek middle-class interviewees construed only those Northerners that were middle-class as culturally superior to the so-called Southerners. Moreover, what gained traction among gay men from Greece and other Western countries in the 70s was the norm to so-called masculinize their behavior. Thus, Greek gay men often avoided contact, including flirt and sex, with those men they regarded as so-called effeminate. This is a long discussion. There was an effort within the gay liberation movement to reach out, for instance, to trans women. The work of Dimitris Papanikolaou is very important in this respect. However, in terms of everyday life, quite often there was prejudice among gay cis men against transgender women because they were viewed in a pejorative manner by gay cis men as so-called effeminate men. So there was gender bias. There again, you can elaborate more on this during the discussion. So overall, what happens is that there is some freedom for gay men in terms of their sexual experience, but again, it's not an unlimited freedom. We can see how stereotypes are at play and how they circumscribe once again such freedom. Interestingly, what happens in the course of the 70s is that mainstream media debate this notion of gay freedom in Mykonos. Overall, the dominant approach of mainstream media towards gay men is quite negative. But in the case of Mykonos, they sometimes make an exception. They tolerate transnational gay encounters in Mykonos. But again, let me stress that this doesn't signal a growing understanding of gay men. It's an exception to their largely homophobic discourse throughout this decade. So, coming to conclusion, tourism catalyzed curved path changes in sexual norms. Flirt and sex on vacation rode on the tide of sexual transformations that affected those groups, but also reinforced them. In this vein, tourism amplified the opportunity of heterosexual women to display their sexual desires, and it also reproduced norms linked to gender, race, and social class, which circumscribed the sexual lives of heterosexual women, but also gay men. These norms could even result in what Vassiliadou describes as brutal intimacies, rapes, with long-lasting emotional and physical effects on women. Therefore, flirting and sex on vacation were not necessarily synonymous either with freedom or with pleasure. So I'm obviously happy to discuss further, to zoom into any of the issues I have addressed, but also if you would like me to zoom out to discuss how sexual transformations in Greece compare to those in other Western countries, or how the transition from dictatorship to democracy did not necessarily result in the democratization of everyday life, more than happy to do so. But let me first thank you very much once again, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Papadogiannis, for your presentation. We already have, I see, the first question, and please I invite our audience members to either raise your hand or by clicking underneath the ticket underneath, or actually clicking and typing your question in the Q&A. So we will proceed with our first question by Eleni. I'll read it out loud. Hello, Dr. Papadogiannis. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, shedding new light on this era in Greece. Just wondering if you have interviewed any Greek lesbians between 1960s and 1980s, or if you can recommend resources for anyone interested in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irini. Thank you very much, Eleni, if I may. Yes, I have interviewed lesbian women, Greek lesbian women as well. Irini may remember my presentation a couple of years ago in Molivos. So very, very briefly, what happens is that Scala RSU becomes a transnational encounter point for lesbian women from several Western countries, including Greece. And this is viewed obviously as emancipating for Greek lesbians. They have intense contact with friends and sexual partners in RSOs. And sometimes this is the beginning of further mobility. They first visit RSOs as tourists. They meet women from Hamburg, from Berlin, and then there is a kind of a wave of migration from Greece to West Germany, of queer migration, under-examined so far, where those Greek lesbians felt more free to express their sexual desires. Now, in terms of sources, I have mostly taken interviews. There are, however, also some written autobiographies, some lesbian publications from that period. For instance, the Ελλάδα των Γυναικών, Women's Greece, which contain narrations of lesbians and their transnational encounters in RSOs. If you would like, happy to discuss this further with you. Feel free to email me. I think that Irini can circulate my email address. So thank you very much for the question.
Excellent. And we have a second question from Jamie. Thank you very much for a very informative discussion. I was wondering if the shifting cultural and social norms you noted were equally applicable to Greece's ethnic and religious minority groups, especially as they're less likely to be influenced by tourism given their geographic locations in the country.
That's again an excellent question. Thank you very much, Jamie. I hope it's fine if I respond with the first names of those asking me. Please also feel free to use my first name. I cannot say much, to be honest. So this is certainly something that merits further analysis. Obviously, there were members of particular ethnic and religious groups. For instance, in Thrace, a Muslim minority, who, as far as we know so far, did not engage so much in tourism and who did not live in places which were at that point tourist resorts. So the obvious answer would be that perhaps they were not so much influenced, but still we might need to research that in more detail. Sometimes there was an indirect impact of tourism. So not necessarily people traveling themselves, but reading about tourism that could also shape their perceptions. It would also be interesting to see a potential, again with a question mark, generation gap, younger people from ethnic minorities being university students, mingling with other people, being influenced by them, but also influencing them. So I think a wide array of questions that would need to be addressed. So thanks again also for this question.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from David Mihardi. In North America, this period was the golden age of television. What were the most popular television programs in Greece and what was their influence?
Yes, in Greece, that was also a period where television gains momentum, slightly later than other Western countries. So it would be mostly, not from the 60s, but mostly from the 70s on, at the expense of popular cinema. It would take long to mention all the main TV shows, but something interesting was, I didn't have time to mention this in the talk, but a phenomenon that appears in tourist resorts where the kamakia, so local men flirting, sometimes aggressively, that's a long discussion, with women visiting those places, especially foreign women. So there was a TV show in the early 80s about the kamakia, and what's interesting, it was based on the book of Vasilikos, and this was stopped while it was transmitted. And the government, the socialist government at that point, prominent member of the socialist government intervened, and it believed that the way in which women were portrayed was pejorative, was negative. So to cut the long story short, television plays a very important role. That's a very good point. It discusses tourism and sexuality from several vantage points, and this continues throughout this period.
That's wonderful. I'm also thinking, and Kostis Kornetis will probably add here, about the machismo iberico, where there, in Spain as well, this idea of the equivalent kamaki, the overtures to members of the opposite sex, and how it manifests, especially in places which are considered to be tourist attractions, the beach. Thank you very, very much, David. And this allows me also to mention that I'm grateful for the research and the interviews, and I have a question about this because it's a very difficult subject matter, and to find and collect testimonies, especially since we are dealing with, in North America as well, I recall in the 1970s, the law changes in terms of what constitutes sexual assaults. So it's a global phenomenon, especially in Greece, with the dictatorship, the different forms of violence manifesting in the private and public sphere. It really calls for a broader reflection on what women were faced with at that time. So shedding light into what's happening in Greece and comparing and contrasting is extremely important. I want to thank you about that. More questions are coming in, so I'll stop here. We have a question from a student of mine, Diana. Hello, Dr. Papadogiannis. You mentioned there was lack of sympathy for women who have been, trigger warning everyone, raped, would differ from lower to higher class. And do you think this was a direct result of decrease in reported cases?
Thank you very much, Diana. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily linked to social class. I would say that there was prejudice, bias against women in general. It would pretty much have to do with the interweaving of gender and so-called race. So there was what I have found in mainstream press, but from judicial archives as well, more prejudice against so-called non-Greek women. But class would, at least in the cases I have found, right, and in the surveys that I have read, would not really matter so much in this case. So there were Western German women, middle-class women were raped, or lower middle-class British women, but one way or another, they were approached in a quite cautious, if not directly negative, outright negative manner in a mainstream press, but also quite often, not always, but quite often.
Apologies, small internet interruption from my end. Thank you very much. I also wanted to ask, as I was hearing you respond to the question, was there, can we see from the testimonies, was there solidarity amongst Greek women of different backgrounds when it came to coming to terms, since, again, the law is behind in addressing proactively, or not proactively, but addressing these kinds of assaults that are taking place, and again comparing it to different countries as well. Do we see women or perhaps joining the feminist movement and being more keen to engage in debates that are taking place across the globe?
Very, very good point. Thank you very much, Irini. We can see some solidarity, and this has to do with the emerging second wave feminist movement in Greece as well. So there are a number of campaigns of events against those attitudes, the sexist and racist attitudes targeting raped women. There are demands for the law to change. At that point, it was very easy for a trial to stop. Very often raped women were pressurized to stop, to withdraw, and what feminists argued was in favor of a more robust process, for instance, but also in terms of changing mentalities, how rapes were discussed in everyday life. So there were the campaigners, the activists. Now, their ideas spilled over into part of mainstream press. I think an interesting example is the magazine Pantheon, one of the most popular women's magazines in Greece at that point. So some of the columnists there were either members or influenced by feminist ideas. So not always feminists directly involved in feminism themselves, but still they were inspired to an extent by feminism, and they began to raise the issue of how to think about feminism differently, not to blame the victims, but the perpetrators, and the profoundly, deeply entrenched machismo existing not only in Greece, as Irini has rightly argued, in several across the West actually, but also in Greece. So in a nutshell, I still believe it's a missed opportunity, because despite this solidarity, law changes only to an extent, only slightly, and public perceptions, unfortunately, as we can witness up to the present day, have not shifted as much as they should have. So I think that there is much more that needs to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we have another question by Harry Kilas. Is there any consideration in your research for young Greeks in the diaspora, the Greek Canadians, for instance, purporting to finding their roots by returning to Greece, but participating in this sexual revolution?
Another great question. Thank you very much, Harry. Yes, I'm trying to address Greeks who had migrated to West Germany. Obviously, this is not the entirety of the Greek diaspora, but I'm interested in the intersection between tourism and migration. And in this sense, the main wave in the 60s and 70s is from Greece to West Germany, not only there, but also there. So what's interesting is that obviously migrants, Greek migrants in West Germany are a heterogeneous social group. For them, coming back to Greece, usually in August on vacation, is a testing ground of sexual mores and patterns. I wouldn't say, however, I would need to be careful with that. I wouldn't say that the Greek migrants were necessarily underdeveloped or so-called underdeveloped in relation to local Germans. There was a process of cross-fertilization, quite often traveling together, mingling in several contexts in West Germany and on holidays, and influencing one another. So there is a very interesting intersection between tourism and migration on the one hand, and sexual changes both in Central and Southern Europe. Now, it's not only the only case. Talking about Greek diaspora, there is some anthropological research, I believe, on Carpathos and young Greeks of Australian origin traveling to Carpathos in the 80s or 90s, if I'm correct. And what the colleague argues is that those visitors, alongside with young Greeks, helped create new spaces, for example, bars where young women and also men could mingle more freely without their parents and flirt. So we would say that also in this case, the young Greeks, the young Greek diaspora was a co-generator of sexual change, also on vacation. Greek Canadians would certainly be another interesting case study. Because of the limits that every project needs to have, I have to focus on West Germany, but I would certainly recommend this as another very important, hopefully very important project.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for the questions. We have two more coming in, one from Dimitri Kralis. You hinted at the CNE take on questions of sexual mores, and I wonder if you have more to say about travel tourism and politically organized youth. Do we have records of official party discussions and decisions about, say, festival tourism, formal or informal, beyond the CNE case? What, for example, of the KKΕ εσωτερικού Eurocommunists? Moreover, in the 80s era, PASOK supported κοινωνικός τουρισμός, social tourism. Did youth have access to that? And were there discussions on possible effects of state subsidy of tourism on sexual mores?
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for your questions. Again, excellent questions. So yes, beyond the CNE, let me start by saying that CNE was one of the most popular communist left-wing organizations, are actually political youth organizations in Greece in the 70s. The youth of KKE εσωτερικού, of Eurocommunists, gained some momentum in the 70s. Not so popular as the CNE, but still quite popular. The youth of PASOK, of the socialists, is also very important and overtakes briefly the CNE. Now, coming back to your question, Dimitri, there is some material about festival tourism. There were also some other battlegrounds. The final year student excursions became an arena where different left-wing organizations competed, and for instance, the pro-Soviet communist youth wanted those excursions to visit Eastern Europe, the so-called Eastern Bloc. Eurocommunists usually detested that. They preferred Western European destinations. And there were also the excursions organized by local cultural associations in Athens and Salonika. So on the one hand, there was the informal tourism in which young people were involved. To be honest, informal tourism was more popular among young people, but there were also some forms of collective tourism. Within part of the debates surrounding collective tourism, obviously sexuality featured prominently. Again, it was a matter of debate. The Eurocommunists blamed the pro-Soviet communists of being too conservative. For example, in the local associations, there are archives, there are minutes of discussions within the meetings of those local associations, where they try to discuss not only where they will go, but how the relations among the participants will be. Will they have to be somehow not supervised, but will the participants be encouraged to be more open in terms of flirt? Not really. So again, we see a clash between visions of Eurocommunists and the pro-Soviet communists. In the case of the youth of PASOK, usually, even though the young Eurocommunists accuse them of being similar to CNE, they often try to distance themselves, the young socialists, from the CNE, and they also try to develop a rhetoric in favor of sexual openness on vacation and everyday life. In the case of social tourism, I have not found anything in relation to sexuality so far, but a very important question and perhaps something to be discovered in the next stages of my research. So thank you very much for all these very interesting questions, Dimitri.
We have one more question from Shiraz Ramji. What was the influence, if any, of African music as well as the music of Beatles and Elvis on freedom of sexuality? And I suspect we can broaden the question as well in terms of broader cultural influences in music or in film.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shiraz. So in the 60s, the transnational youth culture, also Elvis and later on Beatles, reached Greece. There is a segment of the population of young Greeks who are fascinated by such music. We can see some implications for travel and sexuality. So what I very, very briefly mentioned were letters sent to Pantheon, where some young women who were fans of the Beatles would say that they would love to flirt with male fans of the Beatles while they could all be on vacation. So there is some change happening there also thanks to music. However, this was quite contested. For example, the left and the church were against such influences. This changes, however, in the early 70s, at least to an extent. So the left begins to accept rock music, and then throughout the 70s, after 1974, there is a debate. Again, the pro-Soviet communist youth, the CNE, at least in its rhetoric, is far more cautious towards rock music. The Euro-communists far more open. The more radical diverge. Some are more open, some are more cautious. But one way or another, rock music, sexuality form part of debates within the left throughout the 1970s. I wouldn't say so much about African music. So when they discuss youth cultures, they would mainly address US American and British cultural influences. So that would be the debate, again, throughout the 70s within the Greek left, and more broadly speaking, what Greek youth would discuss when talking about leisure and sexuality.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. One final question from me, if there are no other questions from our audience members. You mentioned autobiographies and you mentioned autobiographical writing. Do we see members of the trans community taking to autobiographical writing as there's gradually a creation for space socially, politically, in the collective sphere? Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Irini. Yes, so there are some autobiographies, excuse me, from transgender individuals. One very important is authored by Betty Vakalidou, who was a key activist in the homosexual liberation movement. She was a transgender woman, but she was allied with the gay liberation movement, fighting against the bill concerning the sexual, against what was labeled as sexual disease. It was trying to restrict the lives of transgender women and gay cis men. Later on in the course of the 90s, and even more recently, what happens is that an association, Σύνδεσμος για την υποστήριξη των διεμφυλικών ατόμων, the transgender support, say, association, they created their own publishing house, Polύχρωμος Πλανήτης, Colorful Planet, and Colorful Planet has published a number of autobiographies of transgender individuals narrating their lives back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In a nutshell, I would say that there are two key developments. One is activism and the fraught, not easy relationship between gay cis men on the one hand and transgender women on the other. Gay cis men quite often were cautious, even negative towards transgender women. But what also happens is a number of urban spaces that appear, particularly in Athens, but also in Salonika. Hopefully a relevant article of mine on this will be published very soon. So what I can briefly say is that this could be labeled as perilous refugees, which might sound like an oxymoron, but let me very briefly elaborate. On the one hand, there, transgender women would have to work as sex workers, so they would be often exposed to threats to their lives. Some even died because of abusive behavior of clients, for instance, or policemen. Not died because of policemen, but of clients, as far as I know, but still policemen would often summon them, beat them up. So it was a very, very difficult situation. On the other hand, however, in those spaces, some of them managed to display their desirable gender identity, something that they were not able to do in their place of origin. So it was a very difficult situation, but some of them managed to an extent, obviously totally, to navigate the barriers and also behave in terms of gender as they would have liked. So these perilous refugees appear particularly in the 60s and 70s. They are contested spaces, very often attacks from local people, from the police, but still alongside the activism that appears in this period, I would say that are two key moments in the history of transgender people in Greece. So not so much connected with tourism, but still a period quite rich in terms of transgender experience, also in terms of sexuality.
Would you connect that? Is it close to what we see in the Stonewall riots, along those lines of spaces that are also the police frequently, surprisingly visits and violently clashing with people frequenting in these spaces?
Yes, exactly, Rini. That would be a very good comparison. So police could quite often visit those places, raid, if you prefer, attack the transgender women selling sex. And as a result, some of them, not all of them, but some of them organize themselves and try to fight back, especially when they feel that the new bill will restrict their position even further.
Dr. Papadogiannis, thank you very, very much for this presentation and the research that allows us, sheds light into what are very, very difficult subject matter, but at the same time also allowing us to establish how identities are shaped and change and are being formed at this particular time. I see there's also, yes, we're receiving many thanks from audience members as well for this extraordinary work and ongoing research. And we hope that you can visit us again and contribute and add more on the particular topic and others, especially since we're also working with colleagues on memory and trauma. So this would be particularly important as well to connect. I want to thank our audience members for their questions. And I would like to ask all of you to join us again for what is the next event on Friday, December 3rd, at 2:30 p.m. The seminar will be in person on SFU Burnaby campus, featuring our SFU PhD candidate, Ethan Schmidt, for his talk, The Works of Theodoros Chirtakianos, Rhetorical Commentary and Authorials of Presentation in the Corpus of Early Paleologan Man of Letters. You can register for the event on our website, SFU Hellenic Studies, or send an email to hscommunicationscom@sfu.ca. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all very, very much for joining us, and to our speaker as well. We look forward to seeing you again. Have a good afternoon.